Okay, we're live, yeah? Okay, thanks a million. We had some great sessions and presentations there earlier on today. This is the third session now on labour market evaluation and estimation. And I'm not gonna say much myself. I'll just introduce the speakers and give them as much time as possible because these are all pretty tight for time. Everyone's pretty tight for time. So first up, we have Professor Frank Walsh from UCD, labour market economist, and it's on the trade union wage premium in Ireland. And go ahead, Frank, whenever you're ready.
Okay. So just share my screen there, and these are the slides, so hopefully everyone can see that. So this is some research on how much more trade union employees are paid relative to non-union employees. I've done some work on this before. Just by way of introduction, there is a large literature from loads of different countries showing that trade union members earn substantially more than non-union members, and even after you control for the kind of jobs they do and worker characteristics that might affect their pay. I've done some work on this myself before. I found that the premium was around 10% using EU silk data, and it was a bit lower for the private sector. Basically, today I'm going to employ some new data that's just become available I'll talk about. Just by way of background, the labour force survey shows a steady decline in the percentage of employees who are members, so a decline in density, in trade union density. And I'll show you a picture in a minute to illustrate that. This is in line with international evidence from a lot of countries that trade union density is falling. Just it's worth mentioning, it's not as clear that the share of union contracts that are covered by the share of jobs that are covered by union contracts is falling. The data isn't as readily available, but when it is, the pattern isn't as clear. There's no data on this for Ireland, really. So the question I'm asking in this presentation is whether the premium is holding up and how does it affect wage inequality, basically. Sorry for going so fast. We have to zip through all the stuff fairly fast, but hopefully everything is clear. And if there's questions, even after the presentation, I'd be happy to take them by email or anything. So this is trade union density. Actually, if you take account, if you control for worker and job characteristics, I have a paper on this from a few years ago. This is actually a much smoother pattern, that there's this steady decline in membership over time, and this continues. So I thought it'd be worth seeing whether this has affected the union wage premium. There's also some evidence that the premium has fallen a lot in the UK, whether that's true here. It's worth noting that all the data I'm using here is for employees only. I'm sure there's a lot of people from the trade union movement who are listening, maybe who know that this is an issue. So, for example, this excludes self-employed, retired workers, unemployed trade union members. I know from data from the Register of Friendly Societies that the share of, for example, SIPTU, the share of SIPTU members who are retired went from 4% to 10% between 93 and 2016. So this is a substantial chunk of missing union members. How that affects density, who knows, because we haven't got the data. So just moving along. The data I'm using here is new data that's been made available. This is basically the data that was made that was used in the Public Pay Commission that some of you might remember from a few years ago. It matches administrative data, so basically tax data for wages, which is very good quality wage data. Also administrative data on weeks worked and on sector and whether you're in the public sector or not. This is matched with the labour force survey, which gives you loads of other controls for age, education, gender, hours worked, job, tenure, nationality, region, and so on and so on. So all the usual controls are here. So it's to use this data to try and analyze the question involved. I know some people here might be interested in this, and there's some fairly dramatic patterns. Just very quickly, we can use this public sector definition from the this data because this is an administrative definition of public sector, to look at union density by public sector status over the period from 2011 to 2018. It's declining, but you see the rates are much, much higher in the public sector and in the semi-state sector, much higher rates of density, as we might expect. We see the rates are fairly low and declining in the private sector. One note of caution for this is that this excludes all missing values, so that could lead to a potential bias, that anyone who doesn't answer any question in all of the list of questions in the survey is excluded from the survey. So we can't really control for people who don't answer questions. So that's a bit of a drawback, but the wage data is very good, and the weeks worked and so on. So if we just do a standard economic analysis where we look at the wage premium for trade union, we use what's called linear regression analysis, and this is basically a way of controlling for differences in the share of differences in the, for example, if your gender, or if your sector of occupation, or if your education, all these other things that might affect your wages. Once we control for all those other factors and see what's left in terms of how the union, being a member of a union, affects your wages, we see that there are these substantial wage premiums, both for the private, but a much smaller one for the public sector. I should mention that this is the public sector excluding semi-states. So this is public sector excluding semi-states. A smaller wage premium here, but still all of these numbers, again, when we use regression analysis, usually there's some kind of a measurement error, or some kind of a measure of how well estimated the coefficient is. That's never an issue here. All of these are very well estimated. The p-values are tiny, like so the probability of any error, because the sample is so big, is very small, of any statistical error. So everything is highly statistically significant. You have a huge sample, and it does a fairly good job at explaining the data. So there seems to be this wage premium. We can also decompose the wage premium just to see how it, what are the different factors that contribute to it. Is it, how much of it is accounted for by differences in the characteristics of workers? Are union workers more high skilled? Do they have better education? Maybe they're older and that gives them higher wages. So there might be differences in the endowments or the characteristics of workers and their jobs, which explain the kind of raw differential in wages between union and non-union workers. And how much is left over after that? So this is the thing called coefficients. So for example, for all workers, after you control for all the individual differences in characteristics of workers and jobs, there's a 10.7% premium for all workers from being in the trade union. It's slightly higher for the private sector, for the public sector. So this is just a slightly more flexible way of looking at it than a simple linear regression, where you can break down the effects into different parts. So basically, there's a substantial wage premium. It's bigger in the private sector than the public sector, is the basic message. Then we use this unconditional quantile analysis. Basically, the issue here is if we want to see how this wage premium behaves for low wage workers versus high wage workers. If we look across the whole distribution of wages, so workers at the 10th percentile, that's the 10% lowest paid workers. Workers at the 25th percentile, that's the bottom quarter in terms of pay of workers, and so on. How does the trade union premium behave across the distribution? In recent years, people more and more have been using this unconditional quantile analysis by these guys here. I won't go into that here at the moment, just given the time constraints. But basically, we have we can estimate these unconditional quantiles to see how the effects differ, and the results are fairly interesting, I think. So here's the 10th percentile. This is where the alternative analysis that people have used up until now is the conditional estimates, conditional quantile estimates. So the difference between this and the unconditional is a technical difference, but more and more people realize that the unconditional approach, I think, is the correct one to take, and it's a valid way of being able to compare people at the bottom of the distribution with people at the top of the distribution. So when we look at the conditional for all workers, we see that the trade union wage premium is really big for low wage workers and for all workers at the bottom of the distribution. And it's really when you move up the distribution into the higher levels that the premium tends to be smaller. And what that's saying is that if that were true, is that trade unions are contributing to lowering wage inequality because they're compressing the wage distribution. When we look at the private sector, the same thing is true, except that the guys in the 25th percentile maybe do the best. When we look at the in terms of weekly wage, if you want to use weekly wage instead of the annual wage where you control for weeks worked, you get a very similar pattern. So basically what this is saying is that for both the public and private sector, that when you go up to the top of the wage distribution to the 75th percentile, and we could go on and estimate this for the 90th percentile, that the premium shrinks at the top and is bigger at the bottom. So it's kind of indicating that trade unions are doing the first two things, I think. One is that trade unions are doing well in terms of protecting even the lowest paid workers, which I'd have to say surprised me. I thought it would be more the guys in the middle that did well in terms of the union wage premium.
Just 2 minutes there, Frank, sorry.
Okay. And the people at the top of the distribution don't gain as much from it. So just to wrap up, first of all, we're showing that the share of employees in trade unions is in decline amongst employees. We've no evidence on coverage, so whether the share of jobs covered by trade unions is shrinking or not. Density is particularly low to a degree that surprised me in the private sector, although the data we have for differentiating between private and public sector is could be subject to selection bias, but I don't really think that's the issue. There is a substantial trade union wage premium, and it holds right across the distribution, but tends to be lower at the top of this distribution, and is surprisingly high at the very bottom of the distribution, I think. So that would suggest that trade unions lower wage inequality. The other thing is that in terms of the technical approach I'm using unconditional versus conditional analysis does make a substantial difference to the results we get. So it is important to use this approach. And I can stop there. Thanks. Thanks very much for your attention.
Okay, thanks, Frank. There, I just wondering, I'll pose a question there. Has this trade union wage premium has it gotten bigger, or and what would you expect then with declining rates going into the next decade or so?
Well, I suppose part of the motivation for doing it was that when rates of membership when density rates are declining, I kind of thought, well, maybe the premium is falling as well, that it'd be more difficult for, and you can think of reasons why it would be more difficult for unions to protect their members, but their members' wages, but that doesn't seem to be happening. In terms of the average overall thing, it doesn't seem to have changed since the last time I did it, which was 7 or 8 years ago, I think. So there's no evidence, roughly it was around 10 to 12% that time. Now, there are reasons, but what's striking about this, I think, is that when you look across the distribution here, and this is really good wage data, it's tax data. So a really big representative sample of workers with very high quality wage data. What's striking is that, and we're using the correct technique to look across the distribution, what's striking to me is that the premium is very high at the bottom of the distribution and much lower at the top of the distribution. So it's the differences across the distribution that are kind of striking, but on average, it's about the same when you look across. And
is there a difference? I know, we do a lot of work on the labour market for younger workers post 2008, and with particular declining membership for those groups. Is there Well, obviously, you have an argument there, a clear argument for them to join a union. But is this an issue going forward as well?
Yeah, the young people, I did, just by coincidence, I didn't just look at average membership by amongst age groups, and there has been in the most recent data on membership from the Labour Force survey, you do see a bit of a decline for younger workers. You know, people between 25 and 35, say. And yeah, that is an issue. Now it's not really, to be honest with you, it's not really clear what's what's driving the decline in trade union membership when you look at it, and when you control for, you know, age and sector and all these kind of things, it doesn't really seem to be that these compositional effects are what's driving it. If anything, after you control for all these things, the fall in membership is even bigger. So it's something else that's going on. It's something it's not just a composition effect, but certainly, yeah, it's membership has always been lower amongst young people, though. I think it's worth remembering. So I don't think you just want to look at the rates of membership amongst young people and say, oh, unions are finished. It's always, if you looked at the data 20 years ago, membership rates would have been much lower for young people. It's important.
Okay, well, thanks a million, Frank. That's exactly 15 minutes as I speak, so we're doing well. Brilliant presentation. Thanks a million.
Thanks, man.
Now, how do I get this up now? Now, are we live there as well?
Yeah.
Now, next up is Dr. Nuala Whelan from NERI Maynooth, who has presented with us before, and she's presenting findings from a joint paper with Dr. Mary Murphy, who just presented in the last session. It's called Measuring Employability Outcomes for an Inclusive Post-COVID Labour Market. And go ahead there, Nuala, whenever you're ready.
That's great. Okay, is that okay, Kieran?
That's all right, you're ready to go there.
Brilliant. Okay, so hi everyone, and thanks, Kieran. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Maynooth University working on the ACA PES project with Professor Mary Murphy. So this ACA PES project is a collaborative approach to public employment services. And today I'm going to talk about measuring employability outcomes for an inclusive post-COVID labour market. So I suppose starting off with the challenge, and we've seen a rise in unemployment, particularly with regard to COVID-related unemployment in recent times. And I think it's fair to say that it's likely to be with us for the foreseeable future. And those most affected are younger workers, migrant workers, low-skilled workers, part-time workers, women. But there's also a significant cohort of long-term unemployed and shorter-term unemployed who will be moving into the long-term unemployed category, who were previously unemployed before the pandemic. So kind of highlighting the kind of persistent inequalities in the labour market, and we shouldn't forget about these. And I suppose there's some sectors that have been hit harder than others. So the accommodation and food sector, construction, administration, and so on. So the challenge really, I think at the moment, is in developing an active response, is to find mechanisms that support unemployed people to find good jobs. And we should aim for outcomes that lead to decent work, increased well-being, and access to opportunity for all of the workers who are experiencing labour market disadvantage at the moment. And I suppose there's an increased recognition that post-COVID public employment services will really have a role in caring for the labour force. So people will have experienced quite significant distress over the last few months. So this kind of caring for the labour force will be really important. And I suppose helping people to regain confidence in themselves and their abilities and skills. And also many people will have to move into new work environments, similar to ourselves at the moment. So environments that may be more digitalized or may have different working conditions. The priority should be helping people access sustainable employment and achieving their potential within the labour market, but also strengthening the labour force and helping it to become more resilient for future shocks. But I suppose there is a post-pandemic risk that we may return to normal, and as Mary Murphy mentioned in the previous session, returning to the normal, to any job is better than no job mantra. And this may prevail due to economic, social and political pressures in a time of higher unemployment. But it does present an opportunity for change, and change could include adopting mechanisms and policies that are more inclusive of those who are more marginalised, supporting all workers at different career stages, helping to reverse the negative impacts of unemployment, and protecting people within the labour market and people who may face involuntary work transitions, ensuring that no one is left behind. And traditionally, we've used active labour market programmes to help people re-access the labour market. But as we've highlighted in our recent report, The High Road Back to Work, that the enabling potential of employment-related guidance in caring for a distressed labour force and responding to varying individual needs has never been more important. So we're thinking about the whole, I suppose, cohort of people who may be experiencing unemployment at the moment. And how do we know that these types of labour market programmes are effective, or that they will be effective going forward, considering the types of people that the Public Employment Service will be supporting in the coming months and possibly years? We know that evaluations of labour market programmes have provided, I suppose, really very little evidence of the effectiveness of programmes. Increasingly over the last number of years, the last 5 or 6 years, we're seeing more evidence of this. And evaluations tend to be conducted using economic impact evaluations, randomised controlled trials, experimental methods, and other methods that are looking at cause and effect. And effectiveness is generally assessed in terms of the impact on re-employment, so whether or not the individuals participating in the programme gained employment at the end. But often these evaluations don't show, I suppose, the other effects of active labour market programmes, such as increased employability, improved well-being, hopefulness, self-esteem, and factors shown to enable and support re-employment into the future and helping people to manage their own careers. There's often a lack of analysis of the intervention content and its implementation, so how it's actually implemented. And whether or not there are particular elements of the intervention that work for some and not for others, and under what circumstances. So kind of opening up the black box of interventions has been limited in many evaluations. And there is quite a lot of evidence to show that the quality of the interventions, the conditions of the services, how they're implemented, the type of case officers or case workers who are involved in their implementation really do affect the capability set of job seekers and the range of opportunities that are available to those job seekers at the end. So evaluations that delve deeper into the interventions for the unemployed could provide better evidence and ultimately improve policy making going into the future. So what works? We know that work first programs, so job search assistance, coupled with sanctions and threat type programs, have large short-term effects, so moving people quickly into work, whereas human capital development type programs, so education and training, have larger impacts if they're evaluated over a longer time period. So we see the benefits of these programs generally after 2 to 3 years of completion. There is evidence that there are potential gains from matching participants and program types. So some programs may work better for other people, for some than for others, depending on their labour market needs. But this is very much dependent on having a robust triage system in place, which directs participants into the right program to meet their needs. So these evaluations have been very useful in terms of identifying the effects of an intervention on job placement, but tell us very little about why they work and who they work best for. And so I suppose with this increased recognition on a post-COVID PES playing a more important role in supporting a wider range of individuals back into work and ensuring that no one's left behind, it requires a shift from our narrow understanding of employability, so a work first programme, to a more sophisticated or holistic conceptualization of employability that prioritizes immediate life problems, one of which is a healthy relationship with work. So in our project, we've tried to conceptualize this a little bit further, and we've used a 4-factor typology of employability approaches, which enable effective labour market outcomes. And we've drawn on previous research and previous definitions of these models by Colin Lindsay and colleagues in the UK and Bussy in Belgium. And I suppose when we look at these models, we can see on the right-hand side the work first activation model, which is our current predominant model in Ireland. And this type of model, I suppose, it tries to move people very quickly back into work. It's based on intensive job search, and it's characterized by monitoring and compliance. And as we move from right to left, we can see the human capital development model is more focused on skill and competence development, characterized by sustainable access to the labour market, and it very much welcomes in-work transitions and career development. So seeing people in a more sustainable capacity into the labour market into the future. And as we move again along the continuum, we have the flourishing work-life balance model, which is informed by capability theory and well-being. It's about empowering individuals to manage their own careers and giving them the freedom to choose. And often the participants co-design the intervention that they feel will most meet their labour market needs. And the life first, then again, very much informed by capability and well-being theory, is a more holistic approach to labour market outcomes. It prioritises life needs of the individual, one of which is work, and it's networked and flexible. And I suppose these are not discrete models in themselves, but are often overlap in terms of how they're implemented. And our project really proposes in the current, I suppose, in our current time, a decent work first approach or sustainable approach for people who are job ready and may want to return to work quickly, and a more work-life approach for those more distant from the labour market. And you can see along the bottom of the screen there all of the types of criteria, I suppose, that have been used to describe each of these models. So there's really good evidence and I suppose theorizing of what each of these models might look like in terms of yeah, great. So I suppose each of these models then brings with it a different type of implementation. And I've just outlined there the different types of guidance approaches that each of those models might think about implementing. So a work first model is very much productivist, labour market focused. The guidance, or if you're implementing a model like this, it's very much about job matching, person environment fit. And as we move from work first to life first, we can see the life first model reflects on career ambitions, interests, qualifications, skills and talents. And it's very much focused on getting an understanding of the self, an understanding of context, and transforming context. So for people who are more disadvantaged in the labour market, this type of an approach offers a much broader type of intervention. But all of these are really based on a robust triage system. So being able to direct people into the right model to suit their needs. And there's lots of evidence cropping up at the moment about that more intensive interventions can work. So for example, the recent CICAP evaluation carried out by the ERSI and the EPIC trial also. But there is a need for experienced caseworkers, local interagency working, time to spend with clients, and good employer links. And as I mentioned, each of these models has different outcomes. So we can see the work first model, if we're evaluating it, we tend to just look at job placement. And if we look at the life first model at the bottom of the triangle, we can see the much broader range of potential outcomes. So therefore, these types of models become much more difficult to evaluate. And that's what our project is looking at. So we know that the broader the type of intervention, they tend to be based on one-to-one tailored support. So a range of activities because the intervention is tailored. So how do we measure the outcomes from these types of one-to-one interventions? So at the moment, our ACA PES project has developed a guidance toolkit for practitioners, and we're currently developing a metric that will hopefully be able to show the outcomes from these various types of interventions. We hope to pilot it with the local employment services early next year, COVID permitting, and we'll have a final conference in June. And just also to draw your attention to, we have a conference tomorrow, so apologies that it's conflicting with the NERI conference, but our conference is on digitalization in public employment and guidance services. It will be recorded, so please do contact myself or my colleague Mary Murphy if you'd like to see more. So I'll leave it there.
That's brilliant. Thanks a million, Nuala. So we have time for one question anyway. I'll give it to you myself. So Mary mentioned earlier on about some of the presentations last week in the Dublin Economic Workshop, and you know, some of the evidence you're giving there seems to contradict some of the I remember JobBridge coming up as a positive active labour market policy. I mean, in an environment of such huge job loss that we're facing now, and in terms of overall employment, how effective can those policies actually be?
Well, I think it depends on the good triage. I think everyone has, you know, people present with different needs. And if you have a really good triage system in place that can, and not just maybe a digital triaging or a statistical triaging, but maybe complemented by a practitioner an experienced practitioner who can help you, you know, kind of identify what your specific needs are. There are such a range of active labour market programs out there. And there's also, you know, a very good, I suppose, staffing within the various, within Intrio, the local employment services, JobPath, who all bring different skills to supporting unemployed people. With good triage, you can direct people into the right service. I know one of the things that always comes up as, you know, is community employment schemes, and that they don't tend to show in evaluations the, you know, positive outcomes that lead into labour market, into real jobs. But they do what they're saying. And I think what we're probably not doing is using our evaluation skills to really tap into, you know, the broader benefits that many of the active labour market programs provide for job seekers. So we're kind of missing a trick, I often think, that we're not evaluating as broadly as we maybe could. And that would help, you know, open up those active labour market programs to show what their benefits are, so that we can direct people who really need those supports into the right places.
Well, that's brilliant. Thanks a million, Nuala. Great presentation as always. We'll be moving. All the best, and all the best tomorrow in your in your conference at the same time as ours. All right.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so next up we have Zymantas Baranauskas from IGEES and a PhD student at Vilnius University in Lithuania. And his presentation is on the varieties of capitalism and effects of labour market institutions on business cycle synchronisation in the EU. Now, and
can you see the view okay?
We can see okay there, Zymantas. Whenever you are ready, you can go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So my topic is very on the macro level. We heard some of the papers here, maybe on more than the micro level, but this is just very macro, maybe too much macro. So the name is what's the effects of the labor market on the business cycles. The outline here is what's the main interests. Then I have some theoretical assumptions and some macroeconomic causal mechanisms. Then I show something about the research design, and also I created the econometric model. I ran a few vector autoregressions, but the results are very preliminary stage, so please don't attack me. So what's the main motivation behind this paper? I am interested in the link between similarity in the labor market institutions and the business cycle synchronization. So the goal is to investigate the effects of it on the business cycle. What I call the business cycle here, what I call business cycle synchronization, I call it as a GDP cross-country correlations over time. So of course, there is a lot of theory behind it. International macroeconomic theory highlights the impact of labor market institutions on cross-country correlations, but how does the similarity in labor market regulations across the countries affect business cycle co-movement? This is what I want to find out here. But in order to answer the question, first I have to answer to what extent and how exactly does the labor market institutions can impact the business cycle. And there's of course a vast majority of literature talking about this. What I wrote here is of course not even the 5% of what the literature suggests, how the labor market can have an impact on the fluctuations of the business cycle and of the real GDP movements across the time, right? So Comfort paper mentioned that stricter employment protection legislation makes firings more costly and is therefore expected to dampen output volatility. Also, labor market institutions works as shock absorber. Unions that internalize the macroeconomic consequences of their wage claims can reduce the impact of disturbances on the economy. There's of course far more on that. What's the novelty here? Because the studies of how the labor market impacts the macroeconomics is of course not new. There's a lot of papers written on that, and I of course needed some novelty to bring something to the field. And what I did, I took this theoretical framework that's called the Varieties of Capitalism, which explores the ways in which the institutions structuring the political economy affect patterns of economic performance or policy making and what's their distribution of well-being. So, but basically this theory asks what are the roots of this in economic performance and what are the most consequential institutional differences across the economies here. How is this related? How is the Varieties of Capitalism framework related to my labor market regulations and to business cycle synchronization? It's related in the way that there's two models. There's a liberal market economies and coordinated market. Theory says that the liberal market economies are decentralized with high labor mobility and flexibility, and coordinated market economies are centralized with very low mobility and very strong unions. So the best example of liberal market economy is United Kingdom, and the best example of coordinated market economy is Germany, because I don't know if I mentioned, but my sample is the European Union countries. Of course, the Varieties of Capitalism framework has a lot of differences. I told you only about the labor market, but there's many things here. There's such a differences in growth model, political system, and aggregate demand management regime, and so on. So of course, I'm not going to expand on that because we'll need a separate lecture. Okay, so theoretical part is over. Now it's going to be more interesting stuff. So I have three hypotheses here. The one, of course, says that labor market institutions have a statistically significant impact on how the business cycle synchronize in the European Union across countries. The other one says that the business cycle synchronization will be higher in liberal and coordinated market economies because they are just more similar, right? Not only in the labor market, but on other macroeconomic dimensions. And the last hypothesis says that EU integration together with monetary union improved the business cycle synchronization. What is my sample? My sample is 20 countries. So you can see all the liberal market economies and you can see all the coordinated market economies. You can see the time span, and I divided the time span in 3 periods basically to see did the synchronization increase because of the more European integration? Because in 1999, the optimal currency area was, well, not very optimal, but that's at least what the theory says was created. The euro was created. So what are the business cycle indicators? There's no a very strict rule of how do we call the business cycle, but In the literature, there's usually these indicators: there's quarterly GDP per capita, quarterly unemployment, quarterly employment, quarterly inflation. And statistics, of course, come from OECD and Eurostat. Now, this is the bad part. So in order to get the business cycle from a time series, it has to be detrended. And there's 3 filters, econometric filters, that you can use. There's Hodrick, Prescott, Baxter, King, and Cristiano Fitzgerald filter. So that's what the first slide stands for. So generally, in international macroeconomics, the question of what to call a business cycle is a very huge debate, and we can talk about that for 10 hours. But I'm gonna apply all these 3 filters, and I'll see what I'll get. That will also work as my robustness checks. Okay. So the data comes from the OECD for the labor market. And I consider 7 labor market indicators. The first is the strictness of employment protection legislation. The other one is union density. The other one is replacement rates. It's as a ratio between net income and work. And then there's a wage setting and wage bargaining, degree of coordination and bargaining process, degree of bargaining centralization. They are measured in a scale from 0 to 5. Then I consider the last indicator for my labor market institutions is a tax wedge, which is the extent to which tax on labor income discourages employment. The indicator is measured as a percentage of labor cost. Of course, not only labor market affects the business cycle, so I'm using a very good study by Krzysztof Beck investigating what are the potential determinants of business cycle synchronization, and he finds that these 4 are the robust ones, and I'm using all 4 of them as my controls. So that's just a proxy for controls, which are the economic structure as industrial similarity across countries, trade intensity, fiscal divergence, and Eurozone. For Eurozone, I use a dummy variable depending on when country joined. So that's how my model looks like. So we have a business cycle as a deviation from the filter, which is explained by labor market, by control variables, and then I add some country fixed and time fixed effects because it's a time series.
Just
I have some descriptive statistics here. Now, these results, sorry. I have here some results. They are very preliminary stage, of course, but I did some impulse response and I did some ordinary least squares and stepwise ordinary least squares regressions. That's just how the trended method looked like. So we have here 3 different filters on the same time series, and cyclical component looks different because it's a different kind of filter used. So I did a correlation on market economies, that's what you see here. I did on a coordinated market economies, that's what you see here, and then I did on a whole sample, right? And what I got was the business cycle correlation. So how do you read this? So this is real GDP per capita, and this is the mean of the group's correlation matrices, right? So this means that liberal market economies are more synchronized because correlation is a proxy for my synchronization. Liberal market economies are more synchronized than entities, which is the whole group, and the coordinated market economies as well. The other filter, the Baxter-King filter, coordinated market economies and liberal market economies, again, are more synchronized. The correlation is higher, so that means they are more synchronized than the average on the EU. So that kind of explains my hypothesis, all right? Okay, so I skipped this because I have 1 minute left. Basically, what preliminary results show is that coordinated market economies, liberal market economies have higher correlations than the average of the EU, and that the filter type of what to call a business cycle has a significant impact on the results. And there's some here impulse response functions that I did from VARs. Basically, this is how a labor market institution, which, for example, let's take the first one, net replacement rate, what impact they have on a average life of what you call a business cycle has a significant impact. And there's some other institutions as well as government role in coordination or tax wedge, and they do have an impact on the overall real GDP per capita. There's some other institutions as well as government role in coordination wedge, and they do have an impact called my business cycle. I did some regressions on it. So the model is stepwise regression, just taking out variables that have no explanatory power. The fifth model was fixed affix model. Now, how do you read this? So this I did this as a log model, so it's all in percentages then, and you read this as of when there's an increase in the labor market institutions here, then see that there's an increase across countries, the same increase across countries and labor market institutions. There's an increase in the synchronization across countries because my dependent variable, as you can see, is cross-country real GDP per capita correlations, the trended with Horder-Prescott filter. So I think that makes sense. Of course, my R squared is, how to say, unsatisfactory, but that is because I didn't include any controls and any other variables, just that's a labor market. And of course, we all know that not only labor market affects the business cycle and its volatility. So that's why the R squared does not look very good. But again, this is the preliminary results. So I'm gonna stop speaking because it's already 1 minute away. Okay, thank you.
Zymantas, we're actually going over now, so we're just gonna leave it there. But thanks a million for that's a great. Are you still there?
Okay.
Yes, so you're frozen.
Yeah.
Thanks a million for that presentation. Very interesting stuff, and we'll share the slides and any questions. Maybe you'll be able to answer through email after we finish here. Okay.
Sure, yeah, no problem.
Thanks a million. Yeah. All right. So next up we have Evan Walker from IGEES and working on the Department of Health, and he'll be presenting findings for us for his paper, the Public Service Employment and Expenditure 1980 to 2018, and you can take it away whenever you're ready there, Evan. Thanks a million. Now, let's see here.
Are we there yet? People hear me?
Yeah, we hear you. Good to go there.
Yeah, and you can see my screen, yeah? Perfect. Okay, so yeah, the title of this, as you say, is the Public Service Employment and Expenditure 1980 to 2018. The reason for the 1980 to 2018 is because that was the database that we collected and worked on for a spending review last year. Obviously, given time constraints, I'm not going to go full hog from 1980 to 2018, but I will focus more specifically on, say, the PSSA, the Public Service Stability Agreement era until now. But bear in mind that the results do pertain to the data set that runs from 1980 to 2018. So just a quick disclaimer to keep me out of trouble with everyone involved. This work was carried out when I was formerly with DEEPR. I now work for the Irish Government Economic Evaluation Service in the Department of Health. So any views presented in the paper or any views that I present through this presentation don't represent that of the departments or the ministers. They're my own views and in my capacity for IGEES. So the quick outline, as I said, I'll focus on the PSSA, that era and the paybill growth after then. The setup is a little bit similar to the previous speaker's presentation, where it would be focused on preliminary, not preliminary, but final empirical analysis, I suppose. So there'd be talk about the literature, the data, and then some applied econometric models, and what we can infer from that is the policy implications, part 3. I suppose just to mention as well, this is off the basis of joint work that I've done. So I'd done this as part of my master's program under the supervision of Mr. Michal Collins, who we're familiar with, and also a colleague of mine, Mr. Chris Ryan, who's also an economist in DEEPR. So the rationale for the analysis, I suppose, came from the need to improve the modelling of medium-term expenditure levels. And you'll kind of see that now when I provide a bit of context around that. So the real objective of the paper was to see, let's have a look at this pay bill. What do we know about the data that's there? What do we know about the recent experiences? And how can we try and estimate the expenditure level and the workforce planning and all those good things around the pay bill with a greater degree of certainty? Because when you move into sort of multi-annual frameworks, which is what, say, your pay deal is, your pay deals usually run from 1 to 3 years. You know, every year that you get away from the point in time that you're doing your analysis, the more uncertain things become. And that presents itself a challenge in terms of both, you know, on the industrial relations sides, how do we plan and workforce plan and prepare for a pay deal over 3 years, which gives us certainty. But it also presents challenges in terms of public finances. How do you sort of estimate these things with any degree of certainty, which you'll see here now. So the pay bill itself is quite a pro-cyclical beast. As you can see, this is the pay bill over time from about 2000 to 2019. It wasn't forecast at the time, it's now current. And as you can see, the pay bill is obviously a split between the number of people that are receiving payment as public servants and the rates that you pay them at. And we can see the split there over time. But I suppose before you get into the split, it's important to note how pro-cyclical it is, first of all. So it moves in line with the general movements in the economy. The economy was booming in the mid-north between 2000 and 2006, let's say, and the pay bill was growing way in excess of 5% per annum and above 10% and 15% in some years. Then when the crisis came, complete opposite story. There was heavy cuts and retrenchment of the pay bill, just like the economy. And as you see, as we move out of the program with the IMF in 2014-15, you see significant growth returning to pay bill. So that's the first thing just to note on an empirical objective basis. It's very pro-cyclical. It moves in a highly pro-cyclical fashion. Not only is it pro-cyclical, you know, it's a large component of current expenditure. It takes up about, you know, the last time I checked was about 21% of current expenditure, the pay bill net of PRD. So that's net of your pension levy. So it's large, it's pro-cyclical, but it's also quite volatile. As you can see, if you just take a shortened period of retrenchment, you'll see that the pay bill was reduced disproportionately in terms of overall current expenditure. But as you can see, then it started to be prioritized as, over other areas of current expenditure. That's borne out in these are from the budget and expenditure reports. So as you can see, gross voted current expenditure was grown there in 2016 at 1.8%. At the same time, the pay bill grew at 3%. You go to 2018, when I was working on this, you know, gross voted current expenditure was growing at about 5.6%, but the pay bill was growing at 7%. So that, in a sense, means, like, whether it's implied anyway, whether it's intentional or not, that pay had been prioritized in the post-moratorium period compared to other forms of current expenditure, just on a purely sort of growth basis. And sort of how does that evolve? Well, I suppose there's two things again. There's your numbers and your rates. So let's just look at, even since the PSSA, the Public Service Stability Agreement, where you think, you know, you would be able to estimate, if I'm only going to pay, if there's going to be pay increases of, say, like this one, 2% in October for public servants, that should translate quite easily then into my estimation of the pay bill over the next few years. In practice, it doesn't work like that. As you can see, so even since the PSSA, the Public Service Stability Agreement, where the costs and the forecasts were based on, you know, up to last year, there was 27,000 new additional public servants incorporated in that deal since the time that the deal was signed. So numbers growth is really significant, and that places significant increases on your pay bill. In addition to the numbers growth that you get, so even since the stability agreement, which is obviously the clue is in the name, is supposed to provide industrial stability over a certain amount of time, say 3 years. Even within that period, you know, since the PSSA, we've had significant other areas like sectoral agreements, let's say, that fall outside of the PSSA. So, for example, the Public Service Pay Commission recommended an increased payment for defence forces. There's a healthcare support staff, which went to the Labour Court last year, and that increased pay bill. The enhanced nursing practice also ended up in the WRC and the Labour Court. And then there was a big agreement in terms of the new entrants. So new entrants to the public servants were disproportionately, I suppose, affected with pay reductions at the time of retrenchment. And then this was seen as a way of, resolving that issue. But the point stands that even within your stability agreement, which is supposed to provide your stability, it's very hard to forecast or estimate where the pay bill will go when there's all these sectoral agreements that come into play almost immediately after you've signed it. So that's the context of why we're saying it's important to look at this and see how can we estimate. Like, it's such a large piece of public expenditure. It's clearly very volatile, and clearly I've outlined the difficulties that we as sort of economists and IGEES face in trying to estimate and evaluate, bring it back to the topic of this presentation, to estimate and evaluate the pay bill even over the medium term. So the point of this analysis was to see what we had in terms of the literature, see what we had in terms of the data, and see what we could do then to try and help estimate the pay bill in the future. So we've done an extensive, myself and Michal and Chris did an extensive literature review, and like there's no single literature on the pay bill per se, but there was through different areas of through different literatures, basically there was a lot that made reference to public service employment and expenditure, as you can see there, and we kind of developed this framework, a sort of theoretical framework at least, to consider the pay bill. A big one that came out in the literature internationally and particularly domestically was this point of numbers growth and demographics. So that was inferred, let's say, or was at least assumed in many analysis that was there. So we said we would try and add value to this piece of work by testing that assumption a bit more technically, I suppose. So we just assume that as numbers go up, that places more demand on public services is a fair assumption. But we tried to say, well, by how much, and since we have good population forecasts going forward, like the CSO M2F2, if we could establish a formal relationship here, it might help us, have a better understanding of where public service numbers would go in the future. So a part of this, I'm kind of running through because obviously we're tight for time. So then once we had the literature and we knew where we were going, we had to do a good bit of work with the CSO in increasing the supply of data. So I'll just skip this and say, if anyone wants to talk to me afterwards about the data that we use, particularly in relation to the pay bill, there's about 3 different time series of data that you can use for the pay bill with the CSO. You've got CSO, you've got deeper, but none of them were a long enough time series for you to conduct sort of a long run analysis. So that was a big part of this paper, and we achieved it. I'll skip it now, but if anyone wants to get a hold of that data, please get in touch. So once we had the data, the methodology was to really throw everything that we could at it. So we started off from the most basic, your exponential smoothing, which is basically just an average extrapolation, to autoregressive integrated moving averages, to time series regression, linear time series regression, and then also more sophisticated ARDL and co-integration methods. So the main results of this, so we threw everything at it, and some worked and some didn't work, I suppose. And I'll just focus on the ones that kind of came out as the kind of the headline results. So there was 2 minutes. That's all I need. Yeah. So there was mixed sort of when you're looking at time series data, as some of you know, the stationarity is very important, and the stationarity of the different variables that we're using was quite all over the place. So it limited us in some cases to dropping some variables, including other variables. We couldn't get a perfect equation of the pay bill, let's say. But the headline results would be we came out with an ARDL, autoregressive distributed lag model of the pay bill against sort of the economic cycle. And within there, you see to quite a high significance, not perfect significance, but quite high statistical significance came out. Things like CPI and GDP were obviously, we mentioned the procyclicality of the pay bill. And these were great determinants of the pay bill over time between 1980. But what came out as the most significant result, I suppose, of this paper was the demographics. We were able to show sort of a very strong co-integrating relationship between numbers and your demography, basically. So this is them. So the darker the color, the more statistically significant it was. So in green, the dark green there, you've got your demographics. So you'll see the cohort. So like in log terms, like a 1.5% increase of your old age population, those in the CSO cohort that would be over 65 would place, a 1.5% increase of pressure on your pay bill. So how do we relate this analysis back, the technical analysis, back to the policy relevance? I suppose the key for us, or what you could infer from this analysis, is that the scale of the composition of demographic change will put pressure on the public service employment regardless of your economic cycle. So it's definitely the more dominant feature in terms of what's going to grow the pay bill. And that has a lot of sort of policy relevance, which you can work out for yourselves, regardless of where you are in the economic cycle, and therefore where you are in terms of your revenues and your sustainability and affordability of the pay bill. The ever-growing monster of the demographics will always put pressure and create challenges for our public service employment, and that's just not going to go away, regardless of COVID, regardless of where you are in the economic cycle, regardless of Brexit. So I suppose that was the key finding of this paper, and we put it back then. I'll put it back to you then in the discussion. I suppose, how do we prepare for this sort of ongoing, always unrelenting growth in population, or change in population? How do we prepare for that in an effective, efficient and equitable way? And I suppose that's the key consideration for us at IGEES. Thank you very much.
No, thanks a million, Evan. I was actually just about to ask you that question. How do we prepare for this? And some of the themes from earlier on issues around the labour market, precarity, and people unable to, postponing having children, etc. And so that if we're to take those trends as given, then this problem will get worse and worse. So what do you think yourself? How do we address it?
Yeah, so I think one way, just even in your question there, is how you frame it. Do we see, growth in demographics as always a problem? Is the first point. Demographic change and demographic growth is due to the advances in health services, and it's often quite a good thing. So it's just how we deal with that. Do we frame it as this is a problem and it's always an expenditure containment type thing, or do we ask real questions about how do we deliver a bigger, more flexible, dynamic public service in an effective way? One, does it do what we want it to do? Like does your public service employment reflect the needs of the citizens that want those services? Two, how do we do it efficiently? Through workforce planning, through maybe less pro-cyclical pay deals and more contained pay deals, which would be, easier to estimate over time. That's probably a more efficient way of doing things. And then obviously the equitable, thirdly is the equitable, like how do we do this in a way that's inclusive and it's reflective of society as a whole rather than just, economic considerations. I think they're political questions, and what we do in IGEES is present the policy options for the politicals to make those decisions and outline, here's your trade-offs. So for example, as population changes and grows and our demographic is moving that way, we have to have serious conversations about how we fund a greater and increased public service. That's just non-negotiable almost. It's unrelenting and according to the data. So you put it back then to the politicians and say, well, what's your trade-offs? Your trade-offs are to do this, you trade off by having to, find resources from elsewhere which are used less efficiently, or you have to raise taxes. These are serious conversations that that have to take place. And as we and I just present those trade-offs in the most empirical way we can.
Very good. And we've produced ourselves, NERI produced ourselves areas. I mean, you mentioned taxation there, and I think it's clear, at least in the long run, that there's going to have to be some changes and tax rises wherever they may come from. We've produced papers in NERI showing where we kind of fall down in a European context, gaps there, and yeah, it's something to think about. Obviously, something that's we're going to be forced to think about very soon. All right, thanks a million, Evan. That was a great presentation, and we'll
cheers, lads. Thank you.
So am I still on there, Paul? Let me see. I am. So next up we have Frank Humphreys, also from IGEES, this time from the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. And wait, am I muted? No, excuse me, sorry. And his presentation will be on measuring youth employment when the labour force and educational levels are changing. Whenever you're ready, take it away there, Frank. Thanks a minute.
Great, thanks very much. Sorry, I think you're sharing screen there. That's stopping me sharing.
Are you still there, Evan? Can you stop sharing your screen there?
That's great.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Okay. Excellent. Great, thanks very much. Yes, so I'm focusing on measuring youth unemployment. and the difficulties of using it as a metric of, oh, sorry, the screen has gone funny on me there. Can you see me all right? What's gone wrong? Hello?
That should be it there now, is it?
Yeah, sorry, that's okay. Okay, sorry, yes, and the difficulties, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. The difficulties of using youth unemployment to measure progress or as a target. And I should say, like Evan, the views I present here are my own rather than my department's. So what is the unemployment rate? Well, it's the main Eurostat indicator of youth unemployment, and it's simply the number of unemployed divided by the size of the labour force. Now, so if you want to reduce the unemployment rate, either reduce the number of unemployed or you increase the size of the labour force. And now neither of these is sufficient, and there's an obvious question as to whether they're equally desirable. And then what if the size and composition of the labour force is changing? Is the rate a useful metric of progress? So what does the youth unemployment rate look like in Ireland? Well, there was a big rise in the financial crisis and then a large drop from 2012 down to February 2020 for both sexes. Now, obviously, it started to tick up then thanks to COVID, and the real effect on COVID of COVID on unemployment, both short-term and long-term, will become clear in the coming months. Obviously, we'll see an increase in long-term unemployment from March next year onwards. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on pre-pandemic figures, but the occurrence of the pandemic doesn't affect the analysis. Okay, so live register claims have fallen for all ages and durations. So they've fallen for short-term claims by almost 70% for men and women under 25. And for long-term live register claims, they've fallen even more dramatically by over 80% for both men and women. And again, we see the uptick more recently. So this is, again, the figures are all up to February 2020. Not only have the numbers fallen, but also the share of live register claims that are from young people has also fallen. So, and that's true both of short-term live register claims and long-term claims, that a decreasing fraction are from those under 25. So there have been big changes in the youth labour market, and it's changed both in its size and its composition, and it's mostly due to changing demographics and increasing education levels. So firstly, education. Children are finishing school later, and this is for two reasons. One, they're starting school later, partly due to government policies in terms of childcare schemes, and also demographic pressure that's raising the school entry dates. And they're also staying in school longer because fewer children are dropping out before their junior or leaving cert. And this is true for DESH and non-DESH schools, being quite dramatic reductions in dropouts. So education attainments are increasing in all age groups. So it's not just school age children. So we can see that full-time third level enrollment increased by over 50% since 2000. And the percentage of those aged 25 to 34 with only below upper secondary has halved since 2008. So increasing enrollment rates have reduced the size of the labour force relative to the population, but it's also affected the composition of the youth labour force. So school dropouts are a decreasing proportion of those under 25 in the labour force. So while the under 25s may be more educated, school dropouts may be at an increasing disadvantage. There have also been population changes. So over the last 4 censuses since 2002, the Irish population grew by 22%, and so did the population of children. However, the population aged 15 to 24 fell by 10%. So this has impacted participation rates. So the participation rate is the number of persons in the labour force as a percentage of the total population aged 15 plus. So since Q4 2008, labour force participation has fallen for those aged under 25, and it's fallen particularly sharply for males aged 15 to 19, where it's fallen from 38% all the way down to 23%. So if we look at these changes in the youth labour force, we see that young people are leaving secondary school later, and a greater proportion are doing further or third level education. So as a result, the labour force participation rates have fallen for those aged under 25, as we've seen. Also, post-2008, the population aged 15 to 24 has shrunk. So the labour force has shrunk by even more than the participation rate. And finally then, job seeker claims by people under 25 are sharply down since 2012. So now both the numerator and the denominator of the unemployment rate have fallen, making it even harder to interpret what aspects of the changes could be considered as progress. And you can be in a situation where if the job seekers' claims hadn't fallen by as much, the unemployment rate would have risen, but we might see, yes, but the improvements in education might be seen as positive, even though the rate was rising. Okay, so for the youth unemployment rate to be useful, we need it as a metric. The metric needs to be robust to exogenous changes in the labour force, or else the labour force needs to have been stable over the time period of interest. Now, neither is the case, and both the size and the composition of the youth labour force have been changing, much of it linked to education, also demography. Now, one alternative indicator is the youth unemployment ratio, so which is the number unemployed divided by the population instead of divided by the labour market size. In our case, we're concerned with the age group 15 to 24. Okay, so this is the indicator used as a future jobs metric. So what does that look like? Well, if we graph the ratio since 2008, we see a similar picture to the one we saw for the rate, except the levels are smaller because the denominator is larger. It's the whole relevant population. So if we want to compare the rate and the ratio, we can index them to 100. So if we index them to 100 in January 2008, we see there was a divergence. And this is caused largely by higher education rates and post-crash emigration of job seekers. But the shapes are still similar. So if we compare them, they're both sensitive to education and demography, but in different ways. The ratio better captures improvements in education. As more young people are educated, the rate could rise or fall, but the ratio will fall, all else being equal.
Just 2 minutes there, Frank.
Okay, the rate controls for changes in the size of the labour force, the ratio does not. However, both are determined by the wider economy and whole of government policies. Neither are clear measures of progress. Another alternative is targeting a ratio of youth unemployment rates. So the last Department of Unemployment Affairs Pathways to Work target aimed to reduce the ratio of the youth unemployment rate to the overall unemployment rate. So if we look at the graph of that, that's actually risen rather than fallen, unlike the rate and ratio. So while this attempts to account for changing labour market conditions, its path seems to reflect changes in the relative size of the youth and overall labour forces. So can we do better? So these three, the rate, the ratio, and the ratio of rates, they represent competing assumptions about the core function determining youth unemployment. At least that is if we're using them as targets or metrics. So are these assumptions justified? An alternative to using any of these would be to empirically develop a model for expected unemployment and compare actual with expected youth unemployment. Complex model might be hard to interpret, but it could inspire or inform a simpler metric. Another approach is youth guarantee, where you look at the offers people get, those aged under 25. But so we're concerned with outputs, offers and outcomes, exits and destinations, but there's no causation, and changing labour force and market conditions change prospects for newly unemployed. And also, the extent to which offers are valuable depends on longer term outcomes. So the bottom line is measuring progress in youth unemployment is hard. So what can we do? Well, we can look at longer term outcomes. So we look at some of the things Dr. Whelan mentioned. People care ultimately about their lifetime outcomes in terms of health, income and well-being. There's a strong link between education levels and positive outcomes, and a strong negative impact of unemployment and a positive impact of income and health. So employment and earnings are good proxies, but they don't capture everything, as Dr. Whelan pointed out, and also externalities are missed, such as education. So counterfactual impact evaluations can control for external shocks and can be used to evaluate these employment and earning outcomes over time, but you need very good data and also ideally conduct them over a long time frame. So in summary, for monitoring, evaluation and forecasting, these various rates and ratios are useful and informative. They help in monitoring, but they're not sufficient for evaluation, progress or performance. Counterfactual impact evaluations over a long period are more reliable, but they need time and data. Also, a model for predicting youth unemployment and live register figures could help with monitoring and evaluation, as we look for deviations from predicted levels, with forecasting future needs to help with financial and resource planning, and with policy to better understand how wider policies such as in education impact youth unemployment. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Frank. We're getting to the time now. Michal Collins there, who's helped us host this, is just flagging a low pay project that he has underway using Silk. But I'd just like to jump in there with one question before we wrap up. So I was looking at participation, like you said there, participation rates going back as far as the LFS data allows, which is back to 1998. And the most recent participation rates for those two youngest groups that you mentioned there, 15 to 19 and 20 to 24, are even down in 2019 relative to 1999. And significantly so for the 15 to 19-year-old group. So, and you mentioned that there's more in university, third level education, etc. But that participation rate also shows that these students don't have part-time jobs like they would have when I was in college first time around that time. And I just wondering, with the kind of grants wouldn't keep you going for a year with rent in any of the cities. So what implications do you think that might have on social mobility and the viability of children of young adults from working class backgrounds actually getting their degree, and then even there's no grants for MAs. So what do you think the implications are there?
Well, interesting question. Well, I'm not sure that it's a little bit unclear as to what the implications are for young job seekers, because as the youth labour force becomes increasingly educated, it may, to some extent, make it easier for less educated people, so people who haven't got their degrees yet, or who haven't got the same level of education, to get certain types of jobs because of supply and demand. But on the other hand, they might struggle to compete. So it's not really clear that that lower participation rates are a bad thing for young people looking for work. It's more a reflection of the fact that fewer of them are looking for work and are in the labor force, and more of them are, as you say, are in full-time education, maybe without the part-time job. So it's a positive sign, I suppose, really, that the participation rates are falling. But the particular drop is age 15 to 19, though, which is really those that are school age, and many of those, the legislation has also changed over the time period you've looked at, which makes it harder for young people to work long hours while they're in that age group. And the positive effect of that is the fewer of them have dropped out, and they're staying in school, getting a better education, and improving their long-term prospects.
All right, okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks a million, everybody. Thanks a million, Frank. Thanks a million, everybody. We'll be back in 10 minutes for our final session of the afternoon. Thanks a million, everybody.
Exactly, and just one last piece again for housekeeping. Again, in the chat, you should see a link to attend the next session. As Kieran mentioned, we're running a bit over time, it happens. The next session will start at 14:25. If you have any issue and it says you're in a waiting room, keep refreshing that page link and that should let you in. Thank you very much. I'm just going to shut down this podcast or this broadcast now, and I'll see you in a few minutes. Goodbye.
Thank you.